Hold on, let's bring up the page. Okay. So we're going back just a drop on Dalid Amid Bays 4b, and we're talk. So we had a whole machlekes between, or we had trying to figure out before the Mishnah, our Mishnah, whose opinion does it go according to? We had Rabbi Yossi and Rebbe, and trying to figure out what we do in a scenario where Purim falls out on Shabbos. And how do we when do we read the Megillah when the day of reading is on a Shabbos? So there's different opinions if we read it on a Thursday, if we read it on a Friday, and etc. And we definitely don't read the next day, so we never go the 14th into the 15th. But what happens if the 15th is on Shabbos or the 14th is on Shabbos? But one thing we see clearly from the different opinions is that we don't read on Shabbos. So now the Gemara addresses this question. The Gemara asks, in a way of question, the Kuli Alma Mia Megillah B'Shabbos Loi Karinan, is everyone in agree? Everyone agrees that we do not read the Megillah on Shabbos my time. And what's the reason? What's the reason we wouldn't read the? So we have a whole machlekes, or we're trying to figure out the different various opinions. Hey, Barbara, the Mishnah and the Brisa and the Machlekes, Rabbi Yossi and Rebbe, of what we do in a situation where Purim is on Shabbos because we don't read the Megillah on Shabbos. But who says we don't read the Megillah on Shabbos? Why can't we just read the Megillah on Shabbos? And if the 14th falls out on Shabbos, we read the Megillah on Shabbos on the 14th. If the 15th falls out on Shabbos, then we read the Megillah on the 15th on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, no, my time, and what's the reason? That not everyone agrees that we do not read that we do not read the Megillah on Shabbos. So this is Amar Rabba. Rabba said, "Akol chayavim b'kriyas Megillah." Everyone is obligated to read the Megillah, not just to hear the Megillah, but to read the Megillah. And in the parentheses, we add Tkiyah Shofar because we're going to compare the same reasoning of why we do not read the Megillah on Shabbos is why we do not blow the shofar on Shabbos. When Rosh Hashanah falls out on the Shabbos, and that happens every once in a while, on the first day of Rosh Hashanah in our calendar, and I say our calendar meaning to say that today we have a set calendar. The second day, Rosh Hashanah, will never fall out on Shabbos, but the first day can. On that day of Rosh Hashanah, the first day, we will not read the Megillah. We will not blow the shofar. And same thing applies on every single Sukkot. There is always a Shabbos of Sukkot, whether it's the first day or a middle of the week, or middle of the Yom Tov, where there's a Shabbos Chol Hamoed. And so then we won't shake the lulav on Shabbos. Of course, the difference between lulav on the first day and the second day onwards is if the mitzvah is only on the first day. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai added that we should shake the lulav every day. But nevertheless, if there's an obligation to shake the lulav on Shabbos, we won't do it. If there's an obligation to shake the lulav during the whole Chag and that falls out on Shabbos, we won't. So everyone's obligated to read the Megillah, but not all are experts in reading the Megillah. And the concern is, a person may take the Megillah and want to go learn by the expert how to read the Megillah, or whatever the question is that he or she will have with regard to the Megillah. And then they'll carry 4 cubits in 4 arm lengths in the Rishus Rabbim, which is carrying in a public domain, which is prohibited on Shabbos. Okay, so obviously the question is there's a lot of questions on this. Again, we learned this last week, but the idea there's many questions of why. How could a chiv da'araisa? In this case, this is not the question because Megillah is rabbinic, but the question falls out on shofar. How could you push off a shofar, which is biblical? Concern of carrying, which the carrying itself is biblical, but the concern of carrying, it's not a guarantee that someone would carry. So the concern of carrying is rabbinic. That's a gezerah. Okay, so the next question obviously the main question is, why are we more concerned of carrying 4 arm lengths in a public domain and not concerned with a more obvious one of taking it out from a private domain to a public domain? What's the scenario most likely? Most likely the person is at home, which is their private domain, and the rabbi or the expert, the baki, is an expert, is in another place, right? So the concern is that you're going to take your Megillah and leave your home and carry it from a private to a public domain into the place of the home of the baki of the expert. So that's another concern, where the idea of just carrying it for arm length in a Rishus Harabim in a public domain is less likely, because how do you get there in the first place? How do you get there to move forward? So Rashi addresses this question. Hakol chayavim, all are obligated to read the Megillah. Umitoich shu mechuyev bedavar, and because one is obligated in the reading of the Megillah, hu boho lotze sidei chayva, the person is very concerned to meet their obligation of reading the Megillah, and not that the point is that you're going to find the reading of the Megillah more important than keeping Shabbos. But Baal is kind of overwhelmed, and you may lose focus on the day and forget that it's Shabbos because you're so focused on the Megillah, and end up transgressing the Shabbos by carrying 4 arm lengths in a public domain. So Rashi addressed what does it mean to carry 4 arm lengths in a public domain. We have Renu Arba Amas Vafilu Lon Basada. So Rashi adds the word Vafilu. What's the Vafilu? Meaning to say, the concern is not only a person, seemingly to say that Rashi is the opinion that holds that not only are we concerned of moving it from a private domain to a public domain, that's for sure a concern. But even in the case where a person is Lon Basada, a person is sleeping or resting in a public domain in the field, or Megillah biyada, and you have the Megillah in your space, Yesh Ligzar al Adavar, we're still concerned you may carry and go to the expert. Means if you set up a Erev and you privatize the public domain, then you're still back into private domains. We're talking about a person who's in a public space, obviously restricted to within your 4 amas, your 4 arm lengths, but we're concerned that in being in a moment of overwhelm by the obligation and the mitzvah of Megillah, you can end up carrying 4 arm lengths in a Rishus Harabim. Okay, so trying to bring before there's other cases where we have other mitzvahs that get pushed off on Shabbos. For instance, the obligation to spray oneself with the waters of the red heifer, which has to be Bishlishin Shvi. So it's also not Docha Shabbos. It doesn't push off the Shabbos. So that's why they always make sure that the Shabbos is going to be in a day that's not on the 3rd or the 7th day when you have to spray the waters of the paraduma. And those who learn Maseches Yuma know that they also work at the same thing when it comes to the Kohen Gadol, I think, on Erev Yom Kippur. They also would clean him with the waters, and they would work it out on Shabbos. When Adal Dam and Beis on the bottom, 4B on the bottom. The other time is also Tfilas Kalim. We don't immerse the vessels on Shabbos. You could also say because it's a tikkun, but it's also because of the concern of carrying. Okay. And there's a lot of talk in the Achronim and the Rishonim about what is the concern, and that's why the Gemara uses the terminology akol mechuyavim. Everyone is obligated. Why does it have to say everyone's obligated? Because when everyone's obligated, there's no one really there to watch. When you have in other cases, like when someone has to become pure with the waters, or someone has to be toivel kalim, so then most people are not involved in the mitzvah, so someone else will remind you and say, wait, what are you doing? It's Shabbos. But when everyone is concerned about the Megillah reading, so everyone's equally excited or bahol is trying to figure out how they're supposed to read the Megillah, so everyone's involved, and everyone could be falling into the mistake of not remembering that it's Shabbos. So therefore, because everyone's obligated, first of all, is also the numbers are the chances that someone may transgress the Shabbos is more concerning because everyone's obligated, but also there's no one there to warn you. And a few other things we have. We have also a Megillah. We also have a Milah. Bris Milah is Doicha Shabbos. We have a Limud that Bris Milah is Doicha the Shabbos because it says Bishmini even b'Shabbos. But though we could also have concern on a bris that maybe the moihel will carry the utensils on Shabbos. So A, the moihel is the expert, and B, he's the only one doing the bris, and it's other people there to will be there to remind him. Okay. Let's see the Tosfos. Tosfos addresses the question that we asked. V'yavrenu arba amis b'rshus rabim. The concern is from Rabbah. Again, you have to remember, like Rashi says, "Vafilu lam b'sada." Rashi says, even if you're resting in the field, why even? Because the likelihood of the concern being carrying 4 cubics is less likely than the concern of someone taking from a public domain to a private domain. But either way, v'yavrenu arba amis b'rshus rabim kasha ma'alei kamer v'yitzenu b'rshus yachid l'shus rabim. Why don't we say the more obvious problem that maybe you can take it from your home, which is a private domain, into a public domain? The orchid musa have that's more likely to happen. Although one could say, like those of us who learned our Shabbos class, that a home could be a private domain and then the outside is a carmelist, and maybe only later you're going to go into a public domain, walking to the bucky, and then you're going to be transgressing a biblical transgression versus just walking in a carmelist. A carmelist is a rabbinic public domain. But either way, why don't we just mention it's more likely. That's we're not concerned. From walking out of your house, the Tosfos holds not like Rashi that says vafilu, meaning to say that we're using that for sure public domain to private domain to public domain is a concern. But even just to be in the public domain and carry 4 cubics is also a concern because he may be in the sada. But the Tosfos says no. Why? That a person, we're not so concerned with from private domain to public domain. Why? People wouldn't make that mistake. Why? Because that's people are always careful before you leave your home, not to carry on Shabbos. Maybe sometimes the Megillah is already in the public domain. And then you're going to carry it to the 4 cubics to go to the expert. That maybe is more likely a person will and end up transgressing the Shabbos, and therefore we do not read the Megillah on Shabbos. You have to remember something. What we're saying over here is that essentially Megillah in theory could be read on Shabbos. The reason we don't read on Shabbos is we're concerned that because of the reading of the Megillah, it will cause a person to be forgetful and transgress the Shabbos. Another answer Tosfos says, this is also possible. That one of the conditions to transgress halachically, biblically, from a private domain to public domain is when you lift up akira. There has to be on Shabbos. We know there has to be akira and hanachi. You have to pick it up and put it down, and the akira has to be picked up for the intention to walk out. If you're carrying something in your house, just by the way, you're just walking around your house and then just walk out. When you picked it up, you weren't thinking about walking out. You picked it up to just walk around with it. And then you walk out, that's not biblically transgressing the taking out from Rosh Hashanah because there was no akira. There was no picking up with intention to take out. So therefore, this is also not so concerned with the Megillah. Why? It's not biblical for it to be for a person to have to bring a sacrifice for the transgression of violating the Shabbos. There has to be a proper akira picking up with intention to take out. Let's say you were just cleaning things in your house from one corner to the next, and then you just happen to go outside. When you picked it up, you didn't pick it up with intention to take it out. The part in high time, you don't have to bring a carbon chatas. Of course, it's not allowed, but it's not considered biblical. Let's just do in the second Tosfos. The Avrenu Arba Amis Prus Rabim. Okay, so Tosfos asked the question that I mentioned before. Why don't we push off a circumcision? Everyone knows that everyone's, I'm sure, throughout the years has participated in a bris on Shabbos. Right? Obviously, we don't violate the Shabbos, and we do everything we can before the Shabbos to prepare the baby. The moil has to bring his utensils, etc. We don't push off a circumcision. The chamira. So first the answers is because of how strict a bris is. A circumcision in the circumcision we have 13 covenants of God and the Jewish people when one does the circumcision, and because of the severity of the mitzvah, the concern of carrying is not taken into account, which again gives us an insight how we're weighing the concern versus the severity. Another reason is only experts could be a moil. So then the expert could condition themselves to be prepared. The sakani yesh bedavar, because there is a concern that if a person doesn't know how to be a moyel, you could hurt the child. So therefore, you only hire the expert. Here, I understand. Hopefully, I understand this question. The Riha Levi, Rabbi Yehuda Levi, I think it's Rabbi Yehuda Levi, asks, how do we blow the shofar on Motzei Yom Kippur? Why does he say Motzei Yom Kippur? Because the time we blow the shofar, I think what he means is it's already past the actual day of Yom Kippur, already out of Yom Kippur. But the problem is, but you still haven't made Havdalah yet. So even though it's Motzei, I think that's what he means, but you didn't make Havdalah, and you still can't do any malacha. So how could you blow the shofar if we say we don't blow the shofar on Shabbos? And it doesn't make a difference if it's Shabbos or not, because Yom Kippur has the same rules as Shabbos when it comes to carrying. Visu, another question, maybe the person who wants to blow the shofar on Yom Kippur is also going to go to the expert to learn how to blow the shofar. Just like Rosh Hashanah and Shabbos, if we don't blow the shofar. So to every Yom Kippur, because Yom Kippur is Shabbos, has the same rules of carrying as Shabbos does. We should have been concerned for the same reason that we don't blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. V'tirat seemingly Riha Levi, if that's Rabbi Yehuda Levi, the malacha. One thing is that it's not a malacha to actually blow the shofar. So he's saying the problem over here is seemingly the question is not the carrying. It's two questions. Even if you're not concerned about carrying, maybe it's considered a malacha to blow the shofar. So that he says it's not. It's a chachma. It's something of unique talent. It's a talent, not a regular work. So therefore, it doesn't fall under the work that's prohibited on Shabbos or Yom Kippur. We're also not concerned of carrying the shofar on Yom Kippur. It's not so complicated because on Yom Kippur everyone knows blow one blow. It's not the 30 sounds that we have in Rosh Hashanah. So no one's going to start getting all worked up and going to the expert to learn how to blow the shofar on Yom Kippur. It's just one single sound. And also, it's only a zecher. It's not so important, where Rosh Hashanah is biblical. So therefore, again, the concern that we may carry it to the expert is not going to happen. Rabbeinu Shmuel says, I don't think this is the Rashbam, the dafke b'Shabbos u'b'Rosh Hashanah the im avira arba ames b'Shram iki sur d'raisa b'havada yesh lachish al Motzei Yom Kippur afilu im avira dal ames b'Shram lehave al isur d'banan b'havada legarza the havik zera legzera. He says also there's another reason that on Rosh Hashanah on Shabbos you're going to blow in the morning. I think this is what he's saying. And on Motzei Yom Kippur it's only rabbinic because you didn't do Havdalah. So you didn't do Havdalah unless. So then we're not concerned that maybe you're going to carry a Motzei Yom Kippur to ask the expert. That's a double gezer, and we don't do that. Okay, let's see Reb Steinsaltz notes. He says like this: Megillah on Shabbos. The scroll of Esther is never read on Shabbos. End of story. We do not read it. That's the bottom line. Due to the decree of Rabbah. It's called Gezerah de Rabbah. Rabbah's decree of the concern of carrying 4 cubits in a public domain. Again, according to Rashi and other Mefarshim, seemingly that's what Rashi says, that surely the concern is Rishus Yachid, Rishus Rabbim. Tosfos doesn't agree with that. Some say that it's forbidden to move a Megillah on Shabbos as is considered set aside muktzah. So those who are learning our Shabbos class, we're learning now the laws of muktzah because we don't read the Megillah on Shabbos. Therefore, the Megillah itself is muktzah because it's not allowed to be read. The pre-Chodesh is of that opinion. While some permit it, again, if you remember correctly, we had an opinion that says that we're supposed to learn the Megillah on Shabbos if it's Purim. So then it shouldn't be muktzah. If muktzah is because we can't read it, but we could still learn it, then we would use the Megillah seemingly. So I guess that wouldn't be according to the opinion that we learned then, unless then you would be if learning it or the drasha, right? It says a kol darshim. Remember we learned they're supposed to be when Purim falls out on Shabbos, we do a drasha. We what's a drasha? Some opinions is the laws of Purim, and others hold that the opinions is the learning of the Megillah. And why can't it be the laws of Purim? Because a lot of the laws of Purim we did already if we read the Megillah on Thursday. Okay. Some commentaries note that the language everyone is obligated serves to emphasize the reason that the sages implemented this decree. If the obligation applies only to certain individuals, others would remind them not to carry. However, since the obligation applies to everyone, that's why it says Hakol, there is concern that everyone will be preoccupied with the mitzvah, that they will forget and they cannot carry. So therefore, there's going to be no one to remind anyone. Or at least they will not be able to remind others not to carry because they'll be preoccupied. Either way. Why do we say, and he will carry 4 cubits in the public domain? The early authorities ask, why didn't Rabbah say that perhaps he will carry it from a private domain to a public domain, like we learned in Tosfos? Again, the Ritva, I think the Ritva says clearly that it's Mikala Lakavit, that we're for sure concerned the private domain, but we're also concerned within a public domain itself. So he brings the question: why didn't Rabbah say perhaps we will carry it from a private domain to a public domain? Some explain that it is not common for people to mistakenly carry from a private domain to a public domain, which is what we learned in Tosfos, since there are noticeable divides between them. However, there may be a Megillah already located in a public domain, and one may then carry it within a public domain. Tosfos Amiri. Again, you have to remember something. Tosfos's answer is a little concerning, is a little hard to understand, because the likelihood of that scenario is very unlikely. I mean, why would someone have a Megillah? Oh, you have to remember, a public domain is not even a Carmelist. It's like a public domain. So why would someone have a? See, so Rashi says like you're in the field. I mean, but like what are the odds of that happening? Others suggest the opposite logic. It is clear that there's a concern for carrying a Megillah from a private domain to a public domain, which is a more likely scenario, which makes more sense, like we just said, would warrant a decree. Rabbah adds that even the concern that one may carry within a public domain itself is sufficient grounds for the decree. Okay, so says the Ritva, and that's what's understood from Rashi. I saw Mefarshim say that. Okay, and the Gemara continues. V'hainu time of the shofar, v'hainu time of the lulav. This is the exact same reason why we do not blow the shofar on Shabbos Rosh Hashanah, and we do not take the lulav on Shabbos Rosh Hashanah. Okay, so that's one answer that we have from Rabbah of why we do not read the Megillah on Shabbos, and therefore we have all our questions. What do we do if Purim falls out on Shabbos? Rav Yosef, which was the colleague and contemporary of Rabbah and Rav Yosef, right? Omar says, "Mipnei she'einayim shalaniyim nesuis v'mikra Megillah." So he has another whole approach. Imagine this: because the poor people are their eyes, so to say, are raised to the reading of the Megillah, because they're waiting for the Megillah so they could get, by the reading of the Megillah, matanos lav yoinim, the gifts of the poor. So if it's an happen on Shabbos, they may not get the gifts of the poor. So because of that, we push off the reading of the Megillah. Tani Nami Hach, we also learned such a thing. Afal pisha amru kfar makdim liyem knisa. That even though the villages read early, 11, 12, 13, like we said, so what this means exactly is up to translation. Let's see how Rabbi Steinsaltz says. They're reading to the day of assembly. They also collect the gifts of the poor on that day, seemingly that day would mean the day they read, and distribute them to the poor on that day. Again, we've had many commentaries that try to figure out if it's that or something else. Maybe it is that they also have to give it on the proper day, or it is that's when the poor people know to go to the villages or the big cities where they're reading early to get it. But either way, we see clearly, however you're going to word this wording, that there's an emphasis to make sure that we don't miss out the gifts to the poor. Now, the question is, everyone could just walk forward to this Gemara and say, okay, whatever. It's Rabbi Yosef. But the question is, where does it ever say the gifts to the poor has to be food, has to be money? And where does it say that it has to be? So obviously, if it's money, it's a problem. I'll give money on Shabbos. And in most scenarios, the problem would be that whatever you're giving to the poor, they would be carrying it. They want to be able to carry it to their home. But technically, if gift to the poor would not be money, and they wouldn't be concerned or need for the poor to take it and bring it to their own private space, why can't they just gift the poor on Shabbos? So that's going to be addressed in a second. So it says, Rashi says clearly, you can't give gifts to the poor on Shabbos. Why? We'll see in a second. So when Rashi says, when are they supposed to give matanos lav yoinim? When do they give gifts to the poor? When they read. So it's the job of the Gabbai, right? The Shol's Gabbai or the community Gabbai to make sure that you get the people that come in from the villages that they have to give their donations to the poor. Matanas lavyoinim, and we learn we're going to learn when it comes to Purim that when you have a question to make a big suda or to give to aniyim, to give to the poor, better make a small suda and give more to the poor than to, let's say a person has $100 to spend. He says, well, my meal's going to cost me $80. I only have 20 for matanas avyonim. Halachically, it's better to make a $20 meal and give $80 to the matanas avyonim. It's a bigger mitzvah. Okay, so Reb Tosfos says like this, that Reb Yosef seemingly has a different opinion than Rabbah. Rabbah says the problem is that we have a concern of Shabbos. Reb Yosef says is because we're concerned of the gifts to the poor. So Reb Yosef the Tosfos says that we have to assume that Reb Yosef doesn't argue on Rabbah, he's just adding to Rabbah. Because you can't say that's the reason of why we don't blow the shofar or why we don't shake the lulav. That's nothing to do with the poor. So because everyone agrees we don't blow the shofar on Shabbos and we don't shake the lulav on Shabbos, so Rabbi Yosef would have to agree with Rabbah's reasoning. He adds another reason. And what would be the difference? Why does he have to add it? There's a famous in our learning. Ideas alone is not a good enough reason to say something. A lot of us say things, but there has to be l'may nafkamina. What's the point? What's the point of Rabbi Yosef to add a reason if it's not going to change anything? If he agrees anyways with what Rabbah says, why does he have to add another reason? So he says there is a nafkamina. There is a difference. The migdash likashvus in a place where we're not concerned of Rabbah, which is in the Beis Hamikdash. That's why they blew the shofar in the Beis Hamikdash on Shabbos. They shake the lulav on Shabbos. Right? So we would maybe read the Megillah on Shabbos in the Beis Hamikdash, if that's what they did. Rabbi Yosef, but then we still wouldn't do it because Rabbi Yosef's reason was, say, 1 second, if you're going to read the Megillah in the Beis Hamikdash on Shabbos, what about the poor? So then we still don't read it on Shabbos. Okay. I just want to say that there's a lot of questions over here. The question is, why can't you give matanos avyonim on Shabbos? Rashi says, "V'efshar b'Shabbos." You can't. Why can't you? Like I said, who says we've come accustomed that the gifts to the poor is money, but who says maybe you could give the gift to the poor something else? So here he says a very interesting halachic question, which comes to the general question that comes up. I don't want to get too much into the discussion; it's a little off topic, but about bringing gifts on Shabbos to people's homes. If we have an erev, a lot of people come on Shabbos and they'll bring a bottle of wine. Is that allowed on Shabbos? Can you bring a bottle of wine to someone's home on Shabbos? Right? You're gifting someone on Shabbos. So that some people have the custom of sending or bringing the gift before Shabbos. So he says like this. So he says, so Rashi says because you're not allowed to. So he says, he says like this. We have the Lavan Kavanas Rashi. Why is there a prohibition of gifting on Shabbos? The answer Rashi's opinion, you're not allowed to gift someone on Shabbos. Because then you're making a transaction. When you gift someone, gifting is a transaction. If you're gifting the poor, then it's a transaction. They're now becoming the owner of whatever it is that you're gifting them. And then he brings the Magen Avram in Shulchan Aruch, and he says that here he says an amazing thing. This is only applicable to gifts to the poor because the poor doesn't give anything back besides Taivis Hana and the mitzvah. But the poor person is not giving it back. Then it becomes a transaction. But when it comes to Mashleich Manas, there's an opinion that Mishloach Manas in theory because of carrying is an issue. But you maybe be able to give Mishloach Manas on Shabbos because it goes both ways. Usually, right? Hopefully. Otherwise, you have a lot of people getting offended when you make a nice Shalach Manas for someone and you gift someone and that person says thank you and walks away and doesn't gift you back. You're offended, right? Because you expect if you're going to gift some Shalach Manas, that person gives you back. Mishloach Manas, each person to their, then it's not a kinyan. And that person sends you back a gift. He brings down that there's a difference between making a kinyan and acquisition that the ani, the poor person, acquires the gift, and that's not allowed on Shabbos. Where if a person gifts each other, and gifting each other is not considered a transaction, it's just exchanging gifts, and exchanging gifts you're allowed to. So now the question is about bringing, I'm not going to the halacha question, it's not a halacha class, but one could say that the same thing applies to bringing a bottle of wine on Shabbos, that it may not be such a problem because it's not really a transaction, because it's gifting each other. Why do you bring a bottle of wine? Someone invites you to your home. It's like shoshvinim, right? You're exchanging a friendship. I'm feeding you, and I'm going to bring wine to the meal that we're both eating. Some people say if you bring a bottle of wine, you have to drink it, but that's very technical because then it's part of the meal. But either way, according to Rashi that says e efsher, is seemingly you could just say the simple answer would be because it's money or because it's Shabbos you can't carry. But e efsher doesn't seem to mean because there's a side reason. It means the gift itself is a problem. Why is the gift itself a problem? So the answer is because the ani can't give anything back, and therefore it's a kinyan, it's a transaction. Okay. So now the Gemara asks the question. Let's go back to the text. So what is it? What did we quote from Rabbi Yosef? Rabbi Yosef said that it says that even though they could read early, meaning the villagers read early 11, 12, and 13, nevertheless they have to give the gifts to the poor on that day. He says, what's the wording is a bit off. Even though. The reason why they're gifting early is because they're reading early. Because so the wording has to be that because we read early, and therefore we have to gift early, because sheinem shalanim nesuas mikra Megillah, and they're waiting. The poor are waiting for the gifts, and therefore you have to give it. You have to give the gifts on the day of the actual reading of the Megillah. But what's the afal piece? So he means to say is that we're going to see the continuation. It's the next page. But that's just on Rashi. But that only applies to the gifts to the poor because they're waiting when you read the Megillah. But other parts of Yom Tov, like Simcha, i.e. the meal, that they have to do on the 14th like everyone else. It means they don't do Purim on the 11th, 12th, 13th. They just do the Megillah. But with that, you have to do Matanas Avyonim, the villagers. Means when the villagers read 11th, again, we have to remember what we said from the beginning of this chapter of Megillah, that there's three categories. There's 14th and 15th. 14th and 15th are Purim itself. Everything that was included in Purim is either celebrated on the 14th if you are in cities that are not walled, or on the 15th if you're in the walled cities. That includes all the mitzvahs of Purim. All the mitzvahs of Purim are on the 15th, or all the mitzvahs of Purim are on the 14th. A third category is the villages that can read the Megillah on 11, 12, 13. To this we add that they also give gifts to the poor on 11, 12, 13, whatever the day is that they read. The afal pi is, but nevertheless, the rest of Purim, that they have to do on its day, which would be the 14th. Adrab, mishum da amru lahagdim esakriya, who da amru lahagdim esamataris, can the farish time of Vazel, they shaniyim shalaniyim. Of course, you have to gift because they're waiting for you. When do the poor people have access to the community to collect, and that the gabayim, the community collectors, could collect on behalf of the poor when they are in shul for the Megillah? So therefore, we add to the mitzvah of reading the Megillah, which is one of the four mitzvahs of Purim, right? We have Megillah, gifts to the poor, gifts to each other, exchanging manos, and the Simcha, which is the meal, and the Simcha. So two of them get done whenever the Megillah is. Whenever you read the Megillah, you give gifts to the poor. Why? Because Rabbi Yosef said, because the poor are waiting, and therefore they know that that's the day they could get their gifts, their gifts to the poor. But the rest of it's Ava Simchas, Simcha, meaning the meal, which includes the Mashal Chmanes, and in Nehegas Al Bisman, you have to do it in its proper time. And therefore, even if you're in the villager, you hear the Megillah early, but nevertheless, you would do the Simcha in its proper time. Now, the same thing applies in the event that we said before, like last week, that Shabbos falls out on, Purim falls out on Shabbos. Today, it's only possible that the 15th should fall on Shabbos. So, Matanis La'avyoinim, gifts to the poor, you would do when you read the Megillah, because that goes together with reading the Megillah, which is Thursday night, Friday. Shabbos, we have the reading of Amalek, like we said, and come Sundays when we do Simcha, which is Mashal Chmanos, gifting each other, and to have the meal. Now again, the person has to be careful That's a lot of people find it as also like to find, just like the gifts to the poor, they find it as an opportunity to gift their friends, a mashalach manis, each other, by the reading of the Megillah. You have to make sure that although that's a nice custom and maybe convenient, the actual mitzvah is by day. So you have to leave the minimum amount of the mitzvah of two manos two foods to a person for the actual day. Otherwise, you're not being Makayim, you're not fulfilling the mitzvah of Mashalach Manis. And surely, if you read them, if your Shabbos is on the 15th and you read the Megillah Thursday night, Friday, you have to do Mashalach Manis on Sunday. But even if it's the 14th, you have to do it by day. And if you're going to do it by night, because we learned the opinion that there's no obligation. Some people hold there is an obligation, but that we've learned the opinion that you're not fulfilling the mitzvah of Sudas Yom Tov by day, by night. The Sudas Yom Tov is by day. Okay. Simcha eni negas el bismana. Simcha, what is simcha? Rashi says, shamaychel mishta, eating and being and joyful. Bismana has to be in its proper time. Be yadalad, which is usually yadalad for those who are the villagers. It's the day of the 14th that you have to celebrate it. I'll call yachid v'yachid on every individual. Koyin oisei afilu bismana be yadalad b'toich sheichayve boy b'yom. I'll call yachid v'yachid. Koyin oisei afilu b'yachid ha'kol koyin by v'ike pirsim anes. Sorry, this Rashi is in its wrong place. This man is not for this man. It's talking about the next piece. Let's just see. Hold on a second. There's different questions. For instance, what happens if you're on a boat? What happens if you're on a plane? What happens if you're on a caravan? How does that work? So hold on, but just one second. I want to bring up something I saw before. Okay. So, all right, let's continue. Omar Rav said, Megillah bismana korin oisa afilu biyachid. That's the Rashi that we're supposed to be over here. The editors of the Steinsaltz website are sometimes putting the Rashis at the head of themselves. So Megillah bismana, Megillah on its proper time, korin oisa afilu biyachid. Even if it's the 14th, even if you're an individual, you don't have a minyan, you still read the Megillah. Shlei bismana, but if you're not reading the Megillah in its proper time, which we'll see in a second what that means, then it has to be basara. Means if you're going to, simply said, to read it as the villagers have to have at least 10. Rav Asi Amar, bein bismana, bein shlei bismana basara. Whether it is in its proper time or not in its proper time, also not in its proper time, could be when Shabbos falls out on Purim, or Purim falls out on Shabbos. So you always has to be with 10. So says Rabasi. There was a situation where Rav was shloi bismanoi, bismanoi. It was Purim on his time. Maybe he didn't have a minyan, and he remembered the opinion of Rabasi, who incidentally was a student of Rav, and he was concerned with that opinion, and he made sure to have a minyan for the reading of the Megillah, even though it was bisman. Okay, this little piece of Gemara seemingly is a nice little simple piece of Gemara, but the very fact that the halachic authorities say if there's in an argument between Rav and Rabasi, the law is like Rav, which means to say you don't have to read the Megillah, you don't need 10 to read the Megillah like Rav says. But the very fact that Rav was concerned with the opinion of Rabasi, although he didn't hold, he himself says it's not obligated, so therefore we have to be concerned, like Rav was with the opinion of Rabasi, to always have a minyan. Okay, let's see first Rashi. Bismana biyadalad. When is the time? Is it if it's on the 14th? That's the day you're obligated. I'll call yachid v'yachid, every individual. Karneis afil b'yachid. Then you could read it even as an individual. Why? That call karnin by v'ikir pirsim nes. We have to remember something. We said this a few weeks ago. One of the ideas of Mikra Megillah is that sometimes lost on people, that Mikra Megillah is connected to Presuma Nisa. What is the Megillah? Right? The Megillah is the story of Esther. What does it mean, the story of Esther? We're telling everyone the miracle of what happened. Right? Achashverosh was the king in Persia, blah, blah. Comes Haman and he wants to destroy the Jewish people. And there's Mordechai and there's Esther and there's Truva and there's Balai Lahu and there's the miracle. So what is the reason we read the Megillah? It's Presuma Nisa. Through the reading of the Megillah, we're publicizing the miracle of Purim. So the Presuma Nisa has to be done in public in a public way. In a public way that means in at least 10 people. So here so Rav says that if you're reading it bismanoi, if it's the right time, so because everyone's obligated, although you're reading it you personally are reading it as an individual, but it's its time, so it has a Pesur Minissa. It has the effect of publicizing the miracle, because that's the day everyone's reading it. But if it's Shalai Bismana, so then you, as an individual, there's no publication of the miracle. Seemingly, and just on the top of this Rashi, seems what's the question here? What do we mean by time and not time? Would mean villages versus not Shabbos. Because if we're talking about Shabbos, so what Rashi says that then everyone's reading it on an earlier day, right? Because if it falls out on Shabbos, no one reads it on Shabbos. We just finished saying that everyone agrees we don't read it on Shabbos. So seemingly the same Pesur Minisa would apply to even Shalai Bismana, which would be, let's say, Thursday night, Friday, because everyone's reading it on the 13th, Thursday night, Friday. So he's saying because everyone's reading it, so there's a Pesur Mines. Unless you understand Rashi to say that it's the date connected with the individual versus all the individuals together. A collected group of individuals. Okay. Let's see what Rashi says over here. So this Rashi is back, continuing with Rav. Shalai Bismana. So Rashi says, Kigoyim Bikfarim. So Rashi is of the opinion, what does it mean, Shalai Bismana? Not Shabbos, but the villages, where individuals, certain individuals, are only reading it out of time. Hamagdim li'em that are reading it earlier. Because they don't have a lot of individuals doing it, only the few villagers. Therefore, you must have a minyan. Otherwise, you're not yoytze with Pesur Minisa. There's no miracle. There's no publicizing the miracle because there's only a few people reading it. And the whole reason of reading the Megillah is to publicize the miracle. And if there's only a few people reading it and there's not a minyan, if there's a minyan and a few people in a minyan, publicize the miracle. Rabasi, meaning to say, I mean, just in a technical way, that if a person's a villager and just reading it themselves in their home on the 11th, sitting there alone, I mean, who are you really telling the story to? There's no one knows what's going on. But if you gather a minyan and there's pamphlets and people hear noise, kind of that brings a chevra and that brings Pesur Minisa. Rabasi disagrees with Rav and he says, Bein Bismana, Bein Shalai Bismana. It doesn't make a difference if you're reading it in the Zman or not, in its proper time or not, whether you're the Kfarim, whether you're the villagers or on the 14th. Mitzvah lachzer achar asara mishum Pesur Minisa. He uses the word mitzvah. Not that it's obligatory, but try to. It means lechatchila, try to read it with a minyan, because with a minyan you have Pesur Minisa, notwithstanding of a whole bunch of individuals reading it together. But if you don't have 10, Rabasi is not saying you can't read without 10, but he's saying mitzvah better to find the minyan. So meaning to say that Rav in his initial psak means there's no mitzvah. But he was chash, he nevertheless was concerned, and he actually went with Rabasi, even though he doesn't hold it's a mitzvah as much as Rabasi does. There's no prohibition like saying Kaddish without 10, or reading the Torah without 10. Right? We don't read the Torah without 10, but the reading Megillah, we do read without 10, and you would make a bracha. Okay. A mitzvah Nikreis, but it's a mitzvah too. Rav was in a situation where he could have read the Megillah without a minyan, and he was concerned with Ravasi's opinion, and he made sure to find the minyan. He was alone, or whatever, he was without a minyan, and he went and gathered a minyan because of the opinion of Ravasi. Again, because of this, the Gemara telling us this, right away throws light onto the question of what's the halacha. Because Rav and Ravasi, the halacha is like Rav. But the fact that Rav himself was concerned with the opinion of Abasi, so therefore the rabbi said that it's better to read even in a regular 14th to find the minyan. Okay, now the question about making the bracha. So, but hold on a second. Not everyone agrees with Rashi. If the machlekes of Rabasi and Rav, this discussion that we just had about Bisman and its time, not time, is talking about the villagers. What's the problem? The problem is, like we learned before, this was just an early opinion of Rabbi Kiva. Today, no one does it. There's no such thing. So we're having it seems like a useless argument, because there's never a scenario where there's a yachid is that there's Shalei Bismane. Why? Because either everyone's reading it on the 14th or on the 15th. There's no such thing as 11, 12, 13 anymore. So that Rashi says that we're talking about 11, 12, 14 in the villages, but that's not applicable anymore. So therefore, there's others who disagree with Rashi and says that we're talking about a case of Shabbos. The reason why Rashi doesn't want to say Shabbos is because Rashi learns that why does Rav say that Bismana in its time you don't need a minyan because a whole bunch of individuals is already it makes it a public reading, makes it a presuminisa, publicizes the miracle. So if everyone's reading on the 13th, it's the same effect as everyone reading on the 14th. So Rashi is saying is the reason why Rav disagrees with Ravasi halachically is because when everyone reads it, that's presuminisa. So therefore, if Shabbos doesn't make the only scenario would be less people reading it is if it's the days of Yom HaKnisa, which is when the villagers read it. You're going to say the villagers don't read it, stopped reading it. So he says, others answer that Rashi holds that they read in the villages up until when they had the Sanhedrin that was instituting the new moon, and that extended past Rav. It means there's a time in the Beis Hamikdash after the destruction, which is when Rabbi Akiva lived, right? That was the whole discussion we had. When does Rabbi Akiva live? Rabbi Akiva himself lived after the destruction, right? So the point is that some are of the opinion that they continued with the custom of 11, 12, 13 until they stopped, up until the point of the calendar. Once the calendar kicked in and they stopped sanctifying the new moon, with that, they dropped also the 11, 12, 13. That extended all the way to Hillel the second, which was deep into the time of the Talmud era, which is when they instituted the calendar. So according to that, Rashi could say that there's a disagreement between Rav, which was a student of a student of Rebbe. He definitely learned by Rebbe, like we learn now in Rambam Yomi that we started reading today about the tradition of Torah. Rav learned from Rebbe, and by Rebbe's times they still were not using the calendar. They were still using the Kiddush HaChodesh through the witnesses. Okay, but either way, what Rashi is it makes more sense because Shloi B'Zman to be Shabbos doesn't really change anything unless you're saying. Unless you're saying the day itself is Koveya. Means everyone knows the 14th is Purim. Not everyone knows that we read on the 13th, even though everyone has an obligation to read on the 13th. So who's the everyone? But maybe, so to say, it has a less publicity Purim when it's early, when we read early, than Purim when we read on its actual day. But Rashi makes it clear that there's only a few individuals that read it early when it's Yom HaKnisa, whereas on the Shabbos, everyone's going to read it early. Incidentally, ever since the calendar was instituted, we don't have the 14th on Shabbos either. The only time we have the 14th on Shabbos is only in the few places that they have Purim on the 15th. Okay, let's just learn the Tosfos. Hava uvde v'choshle l'rav lahad Rabbi Yossi. Okay, so now what is the halacha though? Rav says that when it's read in its time, let's say Rashi, when it's read on the 14th, so then whenever the time is either Shabbos and when everyone reads it together, so then you don't need to have it's no mitzvah to have a minyan. So what's the halacha? And Ravasi says it is a mitzvah at least to try to find the minyan. The halacha is according to Rav. The Rav Yochanan Isa Kavasei Perek Sheni. Rabbi Yochanan, okay, in the tradition of Torah, if anyone who's following today's Rambam, so we just might as well mention the Rambam, which is the Rebbe's campaign that starts again today, meaning on the 16th is the first day of the new cycle for the 17th cycle of the one chapter day and the 46th cycle for the 3 chapters a day. So in the tradition of Torah, the 3 students that received from Rabbi, Rav, Shmuel, and Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan lived in Eretz Yisrael. Rav and Shmuel moved and started the 2 big yeshivas in the first generation of the Talmudic scholars that were in Bavel, in Babylonia, in modern-day Iraq, right? So, but Rabbi Yochanan agrees with Rav. In Perek Sheni, in the next Perek, we're going to learn on the 19th page. The Gemara Megillah Aksuva, Ben Aksuvim, Yatu Masik Habi Yachid Habit Tzibur. Alma Shekoyna used to be Yachid. Halacha, whatever it is, forget the subject. But the subject is over there. We see Rabbi Yochanan says clearly that we read the Megillah even as an individual. So we see clearly that Rabbi Yochanan agrees that halacha is like Rav. Rabbi Yochanan halachic, and we learn v'chein halachic the Rav, Rabbi Yochanan halachic Rabbi Yochanan, and v'koshkin hacha the kaim v'chad shitasa. We know that even if there's a disagreement between Rabbi Yochanan and Rav, we go with Rabbi Yochanan. And now we have Rabbi Yochanan that supports the opinion of Rav. So surely the opinion is according to Rav versus Rabasi. V'oi, the Rabasi Talmud the Rav Ava. Another problem. Ravasi is a student of Rav. So surely, if there's a disagreement between the teacher and the student, the law is like the teacher. Rabbeinu Yosef Ish Yerushalayim. I'm not sure what that is. Rabbeinu Yosef, the man of Jerusalem. Pasek, he rules the Af b'yachid tzarich levarech. Okay, this is the question we haven't addressed. What about making a bracha? We could read the Megillah privately, but what about if a person alone is reading the Megillah? Does he make a blessing? So too we find in the response of Rashi, Sheheshiv, where he answers that question.
Hello? Lost the signal.
Yeah, you did.
Oh, it came back.
So what happened?
Oh, I think it's going to come back in a few minutes, a few seconds.
Okay. Well, we can wait.
Yeah,
We
of
got
course.
until 12.
Yeah, of course, of course.
So what are you doing?
Not much.
Did you do anything today?
Yeah. I came back from the New York State, like a conservative.
Here, sorry guys, the
came
guy,
back. No problem.
something
All right.
happened. Let's go back.
Sure.
You're holding. Hold on.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure exactly what happened there. So Rabbi Yosef Ish Yerushalayim says that if you have I'm not sure where I got cut off. Rabbi Yosef Ish Yerushalayim says that even if you have an individual has to make a bracha on the Megillah, and so too we find in the Tshuva in the response of Rashi, Sheheshiv Nira Be'enai V'lo Yishna Yachid V'lo Yishna Tzibur. It makes no difference between a yachid, between a individual or a tzibur or a congregation. Echad mevarach v'acherim shomim, that one makes a blessing, everyone listens. V'chein nira loymar mi'achir she'echad kriyas v'yachid yis Hashem ba'bracha havle lefrushay. Once we come to the conclusion that we read, even if they're reading as an individual, if the opinion would be that we do not make a blessing, they should have said so. Okay, let's see Rabbi Steinsaltz. Rabbi Steinsaltz says like this: the Megillah is read in its time, even in private, in accordance with the opinion of Rav. That's the opinion of Rav. Again, Rav says that you should try to find the minyan. Rashi says, anyways, we read the Megillah. Rashi says there's no argument. Rabbi Yossi doesn't argue. Rabasi doesn't argue that you have to read the Megillah. The question if it's a mitzvah to try to find the minyan or not. But he said like this: the Megillah is read in the time, even in private. In its time, even the Megillah is read in its time, even in private, in accordance with the opinion of Rav, who was the teacher of Rabasi, like Tosfos just said. Rabbi Yochanan concurs with Rav's opinion, like Tosfos just showed us. One should seek out a quorum of 10 to read the Megillah. I think that means in accordance with the custom of Rav himself, because although Rav says there's no mitzvah, but you should still be choishish to Ravasi and try to get a minyan. But if it's not possible to read it with 10 men, it is read privately. Even though Rashi says Rabasi agrees to that as well. If the Megillah, it's kind of hard to find where the argument is, because Rav says to try to find a minyan. At the same time, Rav says you're not obligated to have a minyan, but Rabasi also agrees you're not obligated. It's just a mitzvah to find the minyan. I guess the question is how hard you have to try, right? When we try for something, so according to it seems like that the trying is the question over here. If the Megillah was already read in public and an individual is not present, he may read it privately, even l'chatchila, as it was already read with a quorum of 10 in the same place. Meaning to say, even in the opinion that we're trying to find B'sur Nisa, if you're in the same place where they read a minyan, they read the Megillah, then surely it's not a problem. In such a case, the individual needs to recite the blessings. Again, the Shulchan Aruch is kind of mixing up the laws. Seemingly from Tosfos, there's not even a question. We have to we say the brachas. Rashi explains that this is referring to the villages. That what does it mean that to read in its not proper time means the villages that advance the reading to the day of the assembly. Some find that this is explanation difficult because in the time of Rav, the villages no longer advance the time of reading the Megillah. Consequently, they explain that it is that it is discussing a scenario when Purim occurs on Shabbos. Again, the problem with Shabbos is that everyone reads on Thursday, Friday. And therefore, the reading was advanced to Friday, so says the Rashba and the Ran. The Gaonim explain that this is referring to a situation where one advanced the reading due to an unavoidable circumstance, such as one who is traveling in a convoy. Okay, so there's a scenario that even today, one could possibly read the Megillah earlier. Why? If you're in a convoy and you have no opportunity to read the Megillah on the 14th, so even though we don't have the custom today to read 11, 12, 13, but then you would still read on an earlier date, and then you would still make the Megillah. You would have to read the Megillah if you have an opportunity to read it 11, 12, 13. This individual is permitted to read before the appointed time, like the villagers, on the condition that he reads it in a group of 10 people, according to both Rav and Rabasi. They both agree if you're reading it Shalai Bizmanai, you would read the Megillah on let's see if we how much further we could get in. Okay, I think we could try to finish until the Mishnah. Umiya Omer Rav Hachi, does Rav say this? Omer Rav Yehuda Breder Rav Shmuel Bar Shelas B'Shmeid Rav. We find that Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav, Purim Shechalis B'Shabbos V'Erev Shabbos Manam. So Purim that falls out on Shabbos, then Erev Shabbos is its time. Erev Shabbos Manam v'Shabbos Manam. Why are you saying Erev Shabbos is its time? Shabbos is its time. El Lav Hachi Chomer Shalei Bizmanim Kizmanim. That whatever that then the low bizman happens just like the zman. Ma zmanim afil biyachid, av shlei bizmanim afil biyachid. So how could Rav say that there's a difference between zmanim and low bizmanim? Everything is the same, right? Rav says that Rav is the opinion that says that bizmanim you could read it alone. Shlei bizmanim is not in the proper time. You'd read it in the minyan. But Rav over here says that Erev Shabbos, that Purim that falls on Erev Shabbos, Shabbos is its Erev Shabbos is its time, but Shabbos is its time. What does it mean? That to say that Shalei Bizmanim Kibzmanam, Mazmanam Afilu Biyachid, Av Shalei Bizmanam Afilu Biyachid. So you would think that even a private individual could read it not in its proper time. This seems to support the opinion that we're talking about Shabbos. So let's just skip Rabbi Steinsaltz now. Loi linikri Megillah ba'asara elamai erev Shabbos ma'an lafuki mid Rabbi damer hayol v'nitchu ayaris mimkaimim yitchu liyam aknisa akamashmalan the erev Shabbos manamhu. So no, he says no. That's not what Rav is saying. Rav is not talking about whether you could read it the minyan or not. Rav is talking about when do we read the Megillah. So Rebbe says we read the Megillah on Thursday, and Rav says no. Shalai b'zmanim is kizmanim means that we read it on Friday. Not to read it on Thursday. So let's see what Rashi explains. Erev Shabbos Manamhu Mashma Shehu Zmana Kavulu. That whenever when Shabbos falls out on 14 falls on Shabbos, then Erev Shabbos is its set time. Mimei Anshik Erev Shabbos Manamhu Mashma Shehu Zmana Kavulu Mimei Anshik Knesset Agdela. Midleik Omer Magdim Erev Shabbos doesn't say we bring it before Shabbos. Lahachi Kashalei Shabbos Manamhu. Shai Yudal Hukvel the Prozim, El Hachinakat Hailishna the Tishma Minei, however Tiknu Chacham Sha'acher, Knes Agdoil Lahagdi Mishum Draba. What do you mean that Shabbos? He said the actual date of the 14th is Shabbos, and that's its proper time. Why do we go early? Because Rabbah says we can't read the Megillah on Shabbos. Then the Friday becomes like its day, which is Shabbos, and it's as if it's Purim. For the reading of the Megillah, Alpha Pishlei Bizman, Havik Izman, even though other things possibly we wouldn't do on Shabbos, but this thing, the Megillah we read on Erev Shabbos, even though possibly that's the only thing we do is reading the Megillah, and other Simchas Yom we would do in its proper time or on Sunday. Okay, sorry we had to go fast. I just wanted to finish before our 7 o'clock, our 9 o'clock time in the East Coast and 11 o'clock West Coast, or 12 o'clock West Coast. Laila Tov, everyone. We'll start next week from the Mishnah we finished the first Mishnah in Maseches Megillah. Thank you so much for